Hi. So my name is Peter Haas. I'm the Associate Director of the Humanity-Centered Robotics Initiative. And in my prior life, I did UAVs and hardware. And I am here to talk to you a little bit about hardware today, poor, humble, forgotten hardware, and how design considerations in hardware are going to have serious societal impacts as the number of robots out there scale, and that hardware itself is actually going to be a driver in the scaling of getting robots deployed into the general world. So I'm going to start my story. Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just... There we go. I'm going to start my story with my first drive in the Google self-driving car, which was in 2011. And this car drove better than any human I have ever driven with. Maybe not better than a Formula 500, like race car driver. I've actually talked to a bunch of pro race car driver simulator people, and they say that humans beat the simulation every time. So there's still hope for us humans out there in the world of very competitive AIs. But it drove better than I did on a sunny day. And it did so because it had a nice, expensive $75,000 LiDAR sitting on the roof that could see in 360 degrees. Now, that LiDAR has come down in cost. It came down to $30,000, and then there's that $8,000 LiDAR, the puck there. And in January, we saw the first $299 LiDAR. Okay, so $75,000 in 2011. I mean, obviously not the same capabilities here in the hardware space, but significant reduction in cost. And this reduction in cost is going to be a huge driver in getting self-driving cars out into the world and getting robots in general out into the world. We are going to see advances in hardware along with all of the fantastic machine learning and deep learning and AI stuff that we've been talking about. Advances in hardware are going to drive robots getting out into the general population. Now, this means that traditional, very rare robots, research robots, like the PR2, which is a $300,000 robot that, how many PR2s are there in the world? Like 80? Or like a few score, maybe? You're seeing companies with reduced cost robots, like the Pepper here, which is reduced cost $20,000, but still reduced cost, and they're going to have a lot more of them out in the world. And when you get into the sub-$1,000 robot market, you're going to see even more robots coming out into the world. And I bring this up, this quantity of robots increasing in the world, because there's a question for me about what we do with these robots when they get old. Okay, this is a picture. This is a picture of Ramona, which is a very old robot from Brown, who's in sad shape. And from a straight hardware perspective at end of life, we've faced this before, and frankly, we didn't do a very good job with it the first time. Okay, so the PC revolution produced a significant amount of e-waste that we did not until very late in the game start to get the infrastructure in place and the design in place to be able to do the recycling properly and to be able to reduce the e-waste impact. But even more concerning to me is what happens when we design these things for a shorter lifespan than they actually see in the field. Okay, so this is an example of a very standard consumer product, the router, humble router, which goes in people's closets and sits there for 5, 6, 7 years sometimes without getting firmware upgrades, partially because the manufacturer doesn't want to invest firmware upgrades in such a cheap piece of hardware, partially because the hardware itself is so limited in memory that it can't take the firmware upgrade. This is like the PR2, Okay, anybody tried to upgrade a PR2 to Indigo or beyond Indigo? You're going to run into problems. So this may not seem like such a big issue, but the humble router was responsible for almost taking down the entire internet this past fall. IoT devices, and more specifically routers, did a major attack on DNS infrastructure and came close to taking down the internet during the fall. And if you noticed a few days there where there were troubles getting online, it was people's routers in their closets that were causing that.
Actually, I had one of those routers. There was no firmware upgrade for it that closed the port.
Yeah. So the question is, what do we do for longer-term objects like self-driving trucks that might have a 25, 30-year lifespan, or self-driving tractors that have a 50-year lifespan? And right now, John Deere's answer is, well, we're going to lock down the tractor. And we're going to make it so you can't upgrade the tractor and you can't repair the tractor unless you get a USB bearing service technician to come out and authorize that upgrade or authorize that repair that you've done. So right to repair is an important issue for extending the longevity of these products, and also designing these products for repairability is going to be important, not just for ensuring that the consumer has a full lifespan out of the product, but also for general internet safety and general personal safety as well when you start to get into internet safety on things that are moving 80 miles an hour. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to talk about robotic disability. It's probably not a linear talk, but I'm trying to raise the issue about the relationship about robotics and disability from my perspective, that I'm a designer from Rhode Island School of Design. I have the opportunity to interact quite often with the Humanity Center Robotics Initiative. I'm deeply invested in designing for aging, and I varied in many activities in trying to experiment with prototyping interactive products for the population. So I quite often bring my students to retirement communities and try for them to understand how is to design for the human, designing for one, and trying to really, I know it sounds like a catchy name, but humanizing technology, because design matters. It's what is the differentiator for acceptance and adoption of technologies. And when designing for older adults, it requires a specialized expertise. There are many resources out there that can help us think about that. And so design methods that we designers adopt in various ways to empathize with the user, to really understand their needs, and develop products that really work for them. And there are many different types of these aging frameworks of activities of daily livings and et cetera. So as I was mentioning before, I do follow a personal approach. I call it the P process, in which I ask the students to understand the different positions of understanding preconceptions, users, self-care mechanisms, engaging with stakeholders in order to report successful outcomes at the end. But the end goal of my studios and working with my students is to kind of make a message that let's celebrate disability, because disability can help us to integrate and serve as an inspiration. And I often give the message that disability wouldn't exist if the environment would be enabling and well-designed. It's really the environment who fail us and make us notice the difference that we are disabled, like this room. Someone in a wheelchair would feel different because it cannot go to the back part of the room. But anyway, so we work with principles in order to understand value acceptance and usability. This is a robot from Professor Telex that with the graduate students, we were trying to design the identity of the robot. But other projects that I'm involved with is with Georgia Tech in a major grant, technology to support people's aging with a disability. And there are different components in the grant, from designing robotics to technologies, identifying needs. But it's all about coupling these issues of abilities and environments and technologies that can create a successful fit performance. And we try to embrace certain principles for designing technologies for them. But anyway, it's all about designing for abilities. So when I was preparing this talk, I started saying, okay, so what are the robot abilities or capabilities? And I started writing keywords such as robots are, or robots will, or robots will change what, or make. And then when I went to the can, it didn't do anything with the can. It was all about can't do this. So I was thinking, okay, so if robot can do any of this, what is happening? What are the abilities? What they can do? And sometimes I reflect on the fact that despite all the technologies and robotics that we have, designed, it has had really real world impact, at least in our population. It's very disparate, isolated. So I wanted to start thinking about robotics in terms of inabilities or disabilities and try to reflect on this work related to today's topic. I'm trying to be provocative since Bertram invited us to that. So, and then at the same time, I started entertaining the work. Okay, so I do a lot of work about technologies and disabilities and our goals, and yellow means our goals to what we are trying to do with individuals. Can we empower individuals to sustain independence, health, engage safely in activities, community, etc.? So, I was wondering, what if we put the robots word in this goal? I happened to have the opportunity to use a telepresence robot at CHI last year. It was beautiful because it was a large social context, and I was participating at a distance for a couple of days, and it was horrific. It was fantastic in a way that I was able to, engage with different users. And there's an upcoming article about this, ethnographic study in the next issue of Interactions magazines. And it's labeled, "Are we ready for robots?" The reason that I'm pointing this out is because with colleagues, we felt disabled by the technology participating in this large context. And not only that, people were behaving really strange towards us, pranking us. They started creating Twitter accounts in order to make fun about our disabilities using the robot. These are just like some short statements of the article that is happening. So with that, we concluded in the article saying, is there something new that is happening with robots? Like, can we call it a remote robotic disability? So, as individuals with disabilities, I think robotics are experiencing disabilities not because of their abilities, but because the environment that we are designing to enable them to perform successfully. So this is my, statement. So we do have in industrial design principles such as universal design and trying to get the design right for the users that is responsive to varied abilities, like equitable use, flexibility in use, simple, intuitive, tolerance for error, et cetera. And I think in AI we practice some of these, but I kept wondering, what would be the robotic universal design principles if we were thinking about some of those? Like, I'm glad that you talked first, Marcos, because I thought it was interesting to see, this AI misbehaving in a way. What is to go from learning and being deductive or problem solving to be more like disruptive? And instead of calling it universal design principles, they call it robotic universal design principles in terms of like rude. Can our robots be a little bit more rude and be bad robots and be more unethical? Because they're doing so many expectant things and limited things that I keep wondering, what if they do more than what we ask and be a little bit more creative? So in concluding, I'm trying to just point out that, in my work that is all about aging with disability, I'm trying to put the words robots in front of it and robots aging with disability and what we can do about it. Defend them, like disability as a disruptor. Can we think about robotics, the new robotic ADA, or designing better enabling environments for robots, and just bringing the social a little bit closer to robots. And I think this is too much, so thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Elizabeth Phillips. Most people call me Beth, and I'm a postdoc here at the HCRI. And I'm going to round out today's talk by talking a little bit about the importance of robot appearance from a design perspective. So I'm going to talk to you about why it's important, some research that we're doing here to better understand the importance of robot appearance, and also raise some interesting questions that I've been thinking about as a result of this work. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so very briefly, because I don't have very much time, I just want to make the broad claim that robot appearance is really important for shaping people's expectations of robots, so what they how they come to understand what robots will do and how they predict what they're going to do. And in turn, that very much affects people's interactions with robots. So consequential human-robot interaction. And in fact, there's a bunch of research on this that has shown things like as robots look more human, people expect them to take on more human-like roles. As robots look more human, we expect them to make moral judgments in similar ways that we expect other humans to make moral judgments. And this is as opposed to mechanical-looking robots like the two in the picture. We also, our trust in robots is also very much influenced by the degree to which they look human-like or not. And these are psychological responses to the appearance of robots, but people also have responses in terms of psychological mechanisms that are triggered as a response to the appearance of robots. So for example, as robots appear more human-like, people are more likely to take their visual perspective. So this is not my work, this is a colleague of mine. And the robot here all the way to the right is the most human-like, and people are more likely to take that robot's perspective and view that number as a 9 as opposed to a 6 when compared to the two robots. Oh, excuse me. Thank you, Virgin, for correcting me. Okay, so why is this important? Like, why do we care about this? So just to link to Peter's comment before, robots are becoming more ubiquitous in everyday life, so people will encounter them more. So it's important that people have accurate understanding of how they'll work. And what happens really is that in general, as robots appear more human-like, people anticipate them to have more and more human-like qualities. So human level of intelligence, do things in the same way that humans do. And what happens is that robots fail very often to meet those expectations. So there's a gap between our expectation for their behavior and what actually happens in their behavior. And that's a problem, especially in critical situations like Julie was talking about earlier, hospital settings. My background's in military robotics, military settings, especially important. And the last point is that the tendency for people to attribute human-like qualities to robots is really, really strong, deeply ingrained, and it's way easier to change the design of something than it is to change human nature. So these are some of the reasons why we care. So I want to talk to you a little bit about a three-pronged approach that our research is taking to kind of better understand the relationship between a robot appearance and our expectations about robots. And the first approach is to examine people's a priori expectations that they bring into interactions with robots. So a priori expectations about how they think robots should look. So we did a few different studies where we basically asked people to make visual representations of robots. So draw a robot or create a robot. Tell me what you think it looks like. And here are some examples of the types of responses that we get. These are across domains. So what do you think a military robot looks like, a household humanoid, robots in general, and then an AI. So you can see there's a bit of variance for military and AI, but in general, people tend to have similar conceptions of robots, which are similar to some of the science fiction ones that Joshua raised in his talk earlier. We are also looking at in studying robot appearance, a lot of the work that has been done previously has not been very systematic in how they manipulate the appearance of robots. So what determines on a granular scale, what determines what is human-like versus mechanical. So one of the ways that we're trying to address that problem is by starting to conduct a large review of design features of existing robots. So we've conducted a review of around 250 robots, and we're starting to kind of group them into prototypical exemplars. And the idea here is that we can, with more granularity, start asking the question of, as robots appear more human-like or their appearance features change, what are the psychological reactions in response to that? So that's our second piece of our approach. And the third piece is now not to work with existing robots, but creating robots from scratch. So now we can be a little bit more granular in systematically changing the progression of features in robots, and maybe even create some robots that wouldn't exist for a number of practical reasons, but still be able to figure out what people's responses might be to them. So this is developing a robot scale of appearance so that we might be able to ask people again, as they change more systematically, what are our psychological responses as a result. So all this is well and good for theory and interesting, and it's fun work to do, and asking people to draw robots is really exciting and fun. But from a practical and applied standpoint, it has gotten me asking some slightly related but different questions. And the first one is, we know that people are very susceptible to the design and appearance of robots. But is design really a fix-all solution to calibrating people's expectations to robots? So the example that I think of is Julie Carpenter's work with military robots. And like I said, that's where my background is. And the idea is that these robots don't appear very human-like in nature, but because soldiers who interact with them do so over a long period of time and in critical situations, they tend to form pretty strong attachments to those robots that you wouldn't predict from just appearance alone. So the question is design even a reasonable approach for addressing this potential problem? And if not, what is the implication for experience over time or even training types of paradigms? The second question is trying to tie in with the rest of my speakers here. It's kind of related to some of Claudia's work in aging and elder care, and we've talked quite a bit about that today. Are all mismatches between expectations for robots and reality in robots actually a bad thing? So I started my talk by saying that it's important to match user expectations with what robots can do, but are there situations in which you might want to purposefully allow people to believe that a robot might be able to do more that it could do? And the example that I think of here is robots for elder care specifically. So there was a good article in NPR about 6 months ago talking about doll therapy used for Alzheimer's patients. And the article was, is this beneficial or is this condescending? So allowing people perhaps to believe that this inanimate object that they're interacting with is a child or something that needs to be cared for versus telling them that it's a doll and kind of ruining the facade. So the question is, are all mismatches bad? And I realize that deception is a loaded word here, but is there a time when deception might be acceptable or even desirable? And with that, I'll go ahead and acknowledge my collaborators on this. No one works alone. So thank you, everybody. And I'll leave these up if anybody wants to remind themselves of the questions later. Thank you.
All righty. So this was the panel on getting design right. So do we think we have an answer to what it is to get design right? So I'm personally really interested in this first bullet that you mentioned. Having talked to too many Bayesians, my perspective on this is what you're often measuring is people's prior. That they come in, they don't know anything, so yeah, okay, it's got a face. Mostly the things that have a face can talk, so I'm going to talk to it.
Sure.
But people can update their beliefs, right? And so do we have any sense of how quickly they do that and whether these kind of these early experiences or whether these beliefs tend to really deeply persist or whether people can just overcome them with a little bit of experience?
So my initial reaction to answering your question is that my feeling on it is that people's belief system updates very quickly. So, and I think that happens because people come in, like you mentioned, with all these prior expectations. Robots are going to be great, they're going to do this work for me, and then they inevitably kind of don't meet those expectations. And when that happens, people stop using the technology or they use it for a different purpose. So when I was working in military context, one of the things that we were told quite a bit is that soldiers need to understand very quickly what robots can do, cannot do, and will likely do. And the reason for that is because if it doesn't meet their expectations, they don't understand it, they're going to use it as a hammer. They have no time for that. And then your expensive piece of equipment that we all worked all this time on is now not used for its intended purposes. So yes, I think that people do update very quickly, and it's important that you either calibrate from the beginning or allow some error for an adjustment period, I guess, to get them where they need to be.
Cool. All right, Iris.
I want to know if you came across our talk earlier this morning about being too realistic, right? You get this like creepy robot who looks too real. It's too much like this female, perfectly configured female, and it's just too creepy to interact with this robot. You'd almost wish that it was just more, clunky box-like whatever. Then I can trust it. Right? There's this element of trust. You think like you have to make it more human-like, and then all of a sudden it's gone too far.
Sure. I think you were talking about Joshua's talk earlier.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about some of this while he was mentioning that.
Yeah.
Because there's part of the problem is in the literature, what defines human-like is not set. So at what point do you call a robot human-looking versus mechanical-looking? And it's kind of determined among all the researchers who do that work and whatever stimuli they're using. So in that sense, there's also some research. He mentioned earlier that as robots become really, really human-looking, we trust them less. But there's actually some research showing the opposite, that as they're more human-looking, we trust them more, in opposition to something that's less human-looking, right? So
that you seem to be dealing more with the latter, right? That as it becomes more human-like, it becomes more desirable in your interactions. Is that true?
It's desirable in the sense of like what the application domain is, right?
Yeah.
So what is the end goal of this interaction with this robot, and can we design it in such a way that it matches appropriately for that interaction? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And our research is a little bit through finding all these examples of robots and creating our own examples, trying to tease apart the nuanced features that determine when it becomes human-like. Like, as you add a head, is that now human-like? As you add arms, is that now human-like? And what are the responses, I guess, after the fact by each incremental change?
Can I add something to the question, the uncanny valley? I think that the example that was presented this morning is not necessarily the best example out there of anthropomorphized human robot. Hanson Robotics is doing some pretty amazing robots now that are getting even beyond the uncanny valley. So there's this period where the robot is very creepy, and then there's this period where you're just wondering, is that human or is that robot? And then there's this point where at first you can't even tell the difference if it's from a distance or you're not up close. So I think that we're getting to the point where the uncanny valley may not even be an issue anymore in a few years as mechatronics gets better.
I'm not sure. I guess I don't know.
Empirical question.
I'm not sure I agree. Maybe it's just a matter of, not being in the right generation or something. Maybe I just need to be convinced otherwise. I don't know.
David Hansen went to the Ryan 20%.
Oh.
I had two comments actually for Peter. One is I'm sure you'll be able to tell the robots from the people by talking to them. So I recently met, so to speak, one of the Hanson robots. And the cognitive stuff is a long way to go. I mean, how you feel about skin tone and muscle is, I guess, personal. The second thing is a two-part question. What did you like about the driverless cars? I mean, you said you were more impressed than a human. And then sort of more objective comment is the LiDAR is only good in some circumstances. So it only looks, the commercially available LiDAR only goes out to like 60 meters, and vision can go further. And it's not very good, for example, in the snow, which we're expecting a lot of in the next 24 hours around here. So like, it's a great component to a system, but I was surprised by your overall evaluation. I would still trust human drivers by and large over driverless cars. And the limit, I'm sure the driverless cars are going to be better than us, but I'm not sure we're going to get there tomorrow.
Yeah, so I agree with you on conditions, and I think that my example was sunny day in a closed track. It was driving faster and in more controlled drifting and cornering better than most humans that I've driven with. And another impressive aspect was the fact that the LiDAR was seeing in 360. So it was aware of all the obstacles near the back of the car that I, as a driver, would not be aware of. To your other point, though, LiDAR is limited, and it is only one of many sensors. But that note about hardware cost in general is reflecting a general revolution that's taking place in hardware design right now, where you're seeing things like beyond just LiDAR, like RTK GPS is going down from like $30,000 to sub $1,000. Like various technologies that help robotics are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and that's going to push robots out into the world.
Do you have a thought on hands? I recently just missed a talk by Rodney Brooks where he said, look, there's been no progress in 30 years on hands.
I actually do have I saw a great presentation on Tuesday by Soft Robotics up in Boston, where they were picking up things that I know that the Baxter here has trouble with very easily using a soft robotic hand. So I do think, again, and that's a good example of where there's still opportunity for innovation in hardware to push areas where they're picking up things with no vision, really. Like none of the complex grasping, none of the complex planning for the pick and place was taking place. They're just seeing the object and using the mechanical features of the soft robotic hand to be able to wrap around the object and pull it up.
So I think, one of the things that comes up a few times that I've been to various robot things, and I think this is a good time to bring it up, is kind of this idea of how do our cultural, our unknown cultural biases or our implicit cultural biases have an impact on how we design this hardware. And so like the example that I'll give is kind of this idea that if you look at the hands-on robotics, they're all white. They're all like white humans. And oh, they're just, well, only one. And there's like, but there's like, okay. But my point is that also they are white, if not white, like by skin tone, even in all of the examples that you gave, Peter, they're white plastic, which is something that people have pointed out in like the Apple design, for example, for a while, until it switched to black. But I just kind of was curious if you thought that if you guys have given thought to this and how it changes some of the human-robot interactions and how trust builds and all of these other types of interfaces.
Yeah, and I have a comment about the appearance, and especially when I'm like working with older adults. You know, appearance matters, but it's more about that reliability and persistence of the behavior. So if the thing it will not function as it should and give older adults what they want, I think the shell doesn't matter at some points. There is this initial encounter between the robot and the user, and that's important. But what I was trying to point out with my talk is that I feel that the way that we are designing the robots is limited and is creating this disability between the user and the robot. And personally, I feel, and as a designer, I could have talked everything about the form and the looks and the encounters, but I think beyond that initial encounter, if there is no social intelligence in that interaction, it doesn't have. I mean, the trust doesn't matter. The appearance doesn't matter. We are working with Hasbro and the robotic cat. There was a boom of adoption and feeding the cats real food, and then a couple of months later, the interest just dies, and there is nothing else. And so the cat appearance didn't matter. It's about the abilities of being able to do something for the user, and I just want to put that at front. But
yeah, I would say one piece that I was reading recently about social robots, so the small social robots like Buddy that Peter showed in there, is that a lot of these are intended to go in people's homes, so they're chosen purposefully on neutral colors like all white or all black to kind of fit in with their home environment and not look too ugly or stand out. But I do take Kate's point pretty seriously that can cause a bias in and of itself. Like if we make robots to all be white or just represent the dominant cultural appearance, that really like another bias reflection of our own like projections and thoughts and how we expect people to interact with them later. But yeah, so I think it's two-part. I think it's one, it's somewhat practical decision, and then the other part is somewhat like maybe just not thinking enough about it.
And I think there are opportunities for things like implicit bias studies in robotics that I don't think have been done as much. Like,
well, we will have a talk on that.
Yeah.
Coincidentally.
Thanks. Just another note on human-like robots and Uncanny Valley. We usually talk about Uncanny Valley like the valley, and then there's the mountain on the other side that Hansen's reaching. But a lot of evidence for I mean, the process of Uncanny Valley is multiply determined. There's like the category mismatch, that there's one feature wrong and that's weird. But there's also the fact that it's like the conceptual mismatch. This robot looks like a person, people feel, but this robot doesn't feel. And so the kind of tension between how should I treat this robot? Does this robot react and sense what I'm doing versus like this is a robot, this doesn't sense anything, or it's not vulnerable in any way. That actually is just a linear effect. There's no kind of valley with a mountain on the other side. And so, whereas you may have a perfect category and you may not be able to tell that something's not human, if you know it's a robot, that's still going to create anxiety and tension. And so I think that seeing it as a single determined factor is a limited way of looking at Uncanny Valley.
So to Michael's question about the updating, I think the important distinction that Beth made early on is between beliefs and psychological mechanisms. Beliefs can update quickly, unless they're cultural beliefs which update more slowly. But psychological mechanisms generally don't update quickly. They basically are results of co-evolution. So we have co-evolved with other humans who look a certain way, who respond to us a certain way, where there is convergence of the looks and the response. And I don't mean now skin color, looks just in many sort of more functional ways. And to the extent that robots trigger some of those mechanisms, the danger is that no updating will happen whatsoever, even with experience. Now, of course, if the thing doesn't work, you throw it away. But the mechanism still doesn't update when you throw it away. And the vulnerabilities that come with that are the most important ones. That certain responses invite you to expect, for example, understanding, comprehension, emotional, not necessarily deep experiences, but attachment. There's a reciprocity in our way we form relationships. All of those things are not going to update. So it's up to designers and roboticists to really work on those features and say, okay, if we put this on there, we have to realize what it's going to cause. Now, maybe we want to cause it, but if we do, we have to think this through. And I think that kind of work is really at the intersection of the empirical, the engineering, the psychological sciences that I think we need to know. Because yes, beliefs will update, but it's the rest that's sort of the greater threat to people. Any receiver out there? Wide or narrow? Oh, that's good.
Hi. I wanted to know how do you incorporate into the design phase some legal and ethical aspects? So in 2018, it will be binding the privacy by design principle in Europe, for instance. And I do not know whether you have thought about integrating any of these aspects into the very design phase, or whether having some sort of legal screening in the design phase of the robot, maybe in the conception or maybe also in the prototype, that could help creating safer technology, independently, of course, on whether then the context will matter or not.
Go ahead.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so go ahead and start that. Say that this project hasn't started yet, but we're working on, or soon to be working on, a project with Hasbro, working on the cats, the Joy for All cats, which was mentioned earlier, I think in Selma's talk. And one of the things that we are actively thinking about and talking about as a group, as the HCRI group, is this notion of privacy in the home for elder adults, and also how that affects the sharing of medical information. So compliance with things like HIPAA laws and things like that. So I will say that it's something that we've been thinking about in our group, but because we haven't actually started that project yet, I don't have a great answer for how we're going to address it. So if you have a suggestion, I would love to hear it. Yeah.
If that gives you a bit more of peace of mind, I have a friend of mine that works at European Data Protection Supervisor, and they are not very sure on what that principle means. So I just wanted to be.
Yeah. So for instance, like one of the things that would be really cool if these Hasbro cats did is like help monitor if someone trips and falls. But then you have the question of like, okay, now you have a monitoring device in someone's home, and do you always want to be monitoring? That's really is like quite an invasion of their privacy. But the flip side is the benefit is that you know if they fall down, you can get help to them very quickly. So a big part is talking about these trade-offs between costs and benefits. And just trying to think about these issues on a larger scale. So thank you for the comment. Appreciate it.
I think that the design for privacy is something that can be incorporated at the design phase. And it's something that goes along with actually design for security, because one of the biggest privacy issues with things like baby cameras or in-home monitors is people hacking into them. And when you hack into a robot, you don't just get a camera or a microphone, you get a mobile camera and a mobile microphone. That could,
And a grip arm.
and a grip arm. Exactly. I think that designing for security is something that's a huge opportunity in robotics. And there's a lot of stuff that can be taken from the security community. Like there's a lot of work in the security community with hypervisor virtualization of different domains of work. So you have things like cubes, which separate out different domains of work into different virtual machines, so that if one virtual machine gets hacked, it can be rebooted as a template, and then the other virtual machines are intact. I could very much see that working for robotics. So if your camera system gets hacked, your arm is not vulnerable. Or if your camera system gets hacked, you can reboot the camera system and it goes back to its original state. So I think that stuff like this is a great research opportunity.
And do you expect, or that might be a general question, from policymakers to have a much more concrete explanation or guidelines on how to do all this? Because I think, or I'm sure that the policymaker will say, oh, you need to ensure this balance between privacy and autonomy, etc. But they might not be very concrete on how you're going to do that. Like if anyone would be writing up a guideline on elderly care or robot design, like would you like that they are much more concrete in this regard, or do you think that that would hamper innovation or creativity?
Well, I think you kind of answer. I think when we start putting norms and rules, we fall into the trap that you're limiting what you can do. And I think when you identify what are the vulnerable points, you can get creative in how to overcome them. And Peter was giving, an example of an intervention. So I would not necessarily put that norm. And I think we already have enough, for example, with the Institutional Review Board in trying to make sure that there are no vulnerabilities in what you're proposing. So and if there is one, we can, think about ways of limiting or expanding or being creative in, the usability. So I would not set up those.
The pity of the IRB board that I see is that then we do not learn anything from the IRB approvals, right? Like there's not a kind of collection of all the decisions that they have been taking, so that we could somehow have policies that might be more meaningful in the future. I don't know.
I mean, the danger of policy at this point is stifling innovation. And you have to make a balance there. I was just talking to some AI startups in Boston about explainable machine learning, and I was asking them, do you think there should be policies around explainable machine learning? And they're like, well, do you want the machine learning algorithms to be explainable, or do you want them to work? And there is a very strong feeling that there is a rift right now between explainability and functionality. So if you had policy requiring explainability, then that could hamper what the machine learning could do.
All right, I think we're at our 5-minute break time. What does that mean, a 5-minute break?
We can
I guess it literally means 5 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, we can take one more question, and then it's basically just, it was a buffer time, and There are bathrooms. Some people might want to use them. Men's bathroom is upstairs. And we have actually a 15-minute coffee break after our next talk. So this is really more like to buffer wherever we were. We're actually in time this time. It's awesome.
I'm very concerned about this idea of deception. Not just, well, I mean, not in the example you cited so much, because if you tell an Alzheimer's patient something, they're going to forget it anyway. But much more in terms of, first of all, just the philosophical thing that I have about I do not want the world to be lying to me. I don't even want it to pretend the door can't be, you know. And second, for whatever motives. Second, it's a terrific vector for control, if you can make the deception stick. And the third thing is that there's a long history of abusive deception in law enforcement, and that would be the first place I would expect that to appear. So to me, it's a lot more worrying. You sounded like it was maybe okay in some circumstances. I'm not sure I agree with you.
Sure. So I don't disagree with you at all. And to Claudia's point, you know, the kind of wanted to be a little provocative and raise this issue to see what the response is that I would get back. So yeah, I think really the question I was saying is like I agree that I think deception, and again, deception can be a loaded concept, is probably not good in most of these cases. But is there a notion that it might be in others? So the Alzheimer's example was one, but I think that robots that are currently being used, like in a lot of service industry type of things, are really just a facade. So the robot is a vehicle for a lookup table or a smart search or something like that. But the idea is that it's more enjoyable to you because it's being delivered to you via a robot mouth.
No, it just lets me yell at it.
Yeah. And I would say that's not necessarily deception, but it's definitely like maybe giving you a higher estimation than it perhaps actually has.
Okay, I want to put out a challenge for you.
Okay.
So here's my home robot, and let's assume I have a young child. She's like 5 years old, 6 years old, and she asked the robot, "Am I pretty?" So the robot could either look up on the beauty table on the internet where she is and would say, "Sorry, honey, you're a 2 on a 10-point scale."
Oh my goodness.
Or the robot could say, "Yes, you're pretty. Let's play."
Why can't the robot say, this isn't something I know how to evaluate?
Possibly, but what if it can?
Or there are different levels
Then
of
it would lie
beauty.
as well.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, but we make these too.
Well, actually, the robot I would like to design would say, well, who in whose eyes are you asking about? Because context is everything.
Right, exactly. But that's my point, that the context might well be that you might want to have your robot sometimes lie to your child to protect your child's self-esteem, and you might sometimes actually want the robot to lie to you.
Actually, I want the robot
and it's your decision.
I want the robot to tell me that I am raising a disastrously insecure child.
Sure. If the robot is honest about that to you, then that's also your choice.
It reminds me of the robots in Interstellar, where you can set their honesty level. Maybe that's the answer. You can determine the criteria. Yeah.
There's room for privacy of that sort.
Yeah.
All right, so let's thank our panelists. This was really
Thank you.